Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Landmark, your go-to podcast for navigating the complexities of the property and development industry. I'm your host, James Bailey, Managing Partner here at Bruton Knowles, and today we're tackling one of the hottest topics in land services and development, the shifting landscape of land supply, government reforms and the challenges facing developers in 2024. This has been a rollercoaster for the sector, from ongoing planning delays and new environmental regulations to looming changes in tax policy. Landowners and developers are navigating a constantly evolving environment, but it's not all about the hurdles. There are real opportunities out there for those ready to seize them, especially with potential planning reforms on the horizon. To help us break this all down, I'm excited to be joined today by three of our specialists, Guy Emmerson, William Matthews and Harry Breakwell. With years of hands-on experience in land promotion, planning and consultancy, they bring invaluable insight into how these changes are impacting the market and what landowners and developers should be doing to stay ahead. So, whether you're a landowner, a developer, or just someone curious about the future of land services in the UK, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. So, Guy, as head of the faculty for the business, do you want to do the introduction and overview of Bruton Knowles Land Services?
Yeah, thanks, James. So the planning and development team is focused on helping landowners and local authorities and house builders, mainly across the southeast, the southwest, and the east and west Midlands. But the team's influence extends into all areas of the UK. We're a close-knit team. Some 20 skilled individuals, the majority of whom have got between 10 and 30 years experience within BK. And as such, I think we're one of the leading teams with an unusual depth of experience, and that tends to be recognised by the developers and the specialist lawyers, local authorities, and public and private landowners. We operate under four main banners, I guess, primarily in respect to residential development land, and we can assist landowners in every step of the way, from identifying land for development, appointing developers or promotion companies to promote land through the planning system, and then negotiating the price under an option or marketing the land under a promotion agreement. So those four main strands tend to be development agency, which is the sale of consented land and buildings. And over the last 3 years, I think we've sold in excess of 110 sites, between 350 and 400 million in total, delivering some 5,100 plots. So it's a significant team. The next area is strategic land. So that tends to be the sale of land without planning permission and usually with an overage, grant of option agreements, promotion agreements, site finding and the like. Then there is strong consultancy element to the team. That's centered around valuation, but it's independent expert work, it's arbitration, it's viability assessment for local planning authorities and applicants, it's access arrangements, it's restrictive covenants, and it's overage agreements. And then the final strand is planning consultancy, where we have a team who can deal with planning applications, appeals, feasibility studies, Section 106 negotiations, and the like. So, yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
Thanks, Guy. I think you could tell pretty comprehensive in terms of the level of skills we're developing and the broad range of them, ultimately just helping clients achieve and maximise the value from their land. So let's turn to something very topical, which is current market conditions. So activity levels in 2024. Harry, what's your overall view of where the residential housing market is at the moment?
The housing market has remained pretty buoyant throughout 2024. What I would say is that the positive news of inflation dropping below 2% to 1.7% will ripple down to hopefully a drop in the base rate from 5%, where mortgage lenders will free up more stronger rates for potential buyers. That then will ripple down to a more positive land development market. So that's largely positive throughout this year, really. I'd say market sentiment's improving as well throughout 2024.
Is that driven by the fact that ultimately we simply just don't build enough new houses in this country and haven't done for many years? New houses get built and they instantly get sold, don't they, with a sort of buyer's premium because there isn't enough of them? which is pretty much UK wide, I think, really. I mean, obviously in the southwest, it's highlighted more because you've got key cities like Gloucester, Bristol, Cheltenham that people want to live and work around.
I think it's led by areas of economic growth predominantly, with urban extensions in areas where there's major employment or specific areas of industry.
I suppose the problem for us is that we're dealing with the raw material, aren't we? Which is the land. I think ultimately when we talk about houses and we see them being built, there's a very, very long timeline from when we're dealing with landowners that are effectively holding an agricultural holding, aren't they? And developing that through the planning system and coming out the other side. So, I mean, activity levels, from what you seem to be saying, have held up pretty well, despite changes in government, 5 prime ministers.
Yeah, and I think if our team's performance over 2024 is anything to go by, then the market is buoyant because it's been a good year for us. And I think that land values generally tend to track house prices. And so, Harry's comment that the market is more positive, I think is right. It's stable rather than particularly buoyant, but there are more entrants into the market. There is more confidence that the houses they're going to build will be sold, and sold at a rate that makes economic sense to them. We're not at the dizzy heights of early to mid 2022 in the run up to the 2022 budget, which of course put the brakes on a lot of things, but in particular the housing market and therefore the land market. But yeah, a good housing market will generally mean a good land market, and areas like the north are seeing the biggest increases in house prices, and probably therefore also the biggest increases in land values. And it's probably no surprise that those northern areas are the areas that are being told that they've got to deliver the most additional houses.
So it's building post the election. Prior to the election, there were concerns from many SMEs and PLC house builders with slow sales rates of houses. I think that's the market has improved in that regard, but many SMEs, PLCs, they're still concerned about other elements such as high build costs, high finance rates, and that ripples down to obviously the interest and base rates. So yeah, it's building, positivity is building throughout this year, I would say.
I do think at a national level, with a number of potential mergers of residential developers and developers acquiring land promotion companies, there's a real focus on strategic land and also economies of scale with large developments. There's a very active market with small, medium and large developers, but those large developers seem quite acquisitive, with a number of attempts to acquire the likes of the PLCs and merge to become even stronger.
So let's have just a brief overview of the supply and consent delays that exist in the land and housing sector. I mean, obviously, most people understand that it takes an awful long time to get planning consent in place. And we understand this must continue to frustrate landowners and developers. I mean, much of this is despite government, not because of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are fundamental problems around, and this isn't a criticism in any way. I just think it's a fact.
It can be critical.
But I think it is just a fundamental lack of resource at the local planning authority, able to deal with complex and difficult cases, and as a result, they tend to run on for a long time. And it does take years to deliver significant schemes.
And is that planning officers that you're talking about, people that actually review these and then make recommendations to planning committees?
Yeah, the whole planning department. Yeah.
I mean, the government did pledge, didn't they, 300 additional planning officers.
Indeed.
But more support's needed there, evidently. I mean, that's a drop in the ocean, isn't it, really?
And in terms of local plans, which largely dictate where development's going to occur, it's quite a small proportion of local authorities nationally with an up-to-date local plan within the last 5 years. So there are a large number of authorities with outdated local plans, either under review or not in accordance with housing requirement numbers.
Let alone new housing requirement numbers.
Yeah.
Which will be a real, shock to the system. I think I did read that housing consents fell behind housing completions for the first time in, 15 years or something last year, which, isn't a good thing. And housing, the delivery of housing numbers is falling, I think, to under 200,000 in a year. And when all aspirations are around 300,000 a year, we can see there is a significant gap, and there does need to be a big shake-up in the market, and that is what seems to be happening with the Labour manifesto. We know that the NPPF has been out for consultation, and everyone's on tenterhooks to see what that looks like by the time it's come back out the other side, and see whether it's been watered down or not.
And with local authorities where there are deficiencies in their delivery, largely housing delivery is appeal-led, where developers are taking sites that aren't in accordance with local plan and taking them to appeal, and in some circumstances sites that are in accordance with the local plan and taking those to appeal for a variety of reasons. I think there's a number of wider influences as well as to housing delivery, not just shortage of planning consents, but also shortage of skilled workers, construction companies, and also things like highways capacity and other infrastructure as well.
It's quite depressing at many levels, isn't it? Because when you start to talk about it, there's probably 50 things that impact a major planning consent, and some of those influences are way beyond the control of a developer, simply because it's much larger than it is infrastructure. It is unfortunately things that can only be unlocked perhaps at governmental level. But it's like anything, I suppose. What you're driving to is it's a timeline, isn't it? The timeline is too long.
Yeah, and we've got currently at the moment another real issue that I think the government needs to get its head around is that it's all very well imposing high affordable housing requirements on a scheme, but what the market is finding is that the housing associations aren't able to bid on new affordable housing units because they're not sure where their funding is coming from, and what funding they do have is being diverted into management and maintenance and improvement of existing stock. So if you haven't got anyone to take the affordable housing element of the scheme, your scheme can't go forward, particularly as most consents will tend to say you're not able to occupy more than X percent of your private houses until you've got your affordable units sold. So that funding issue has got to be resolved, because that's got to unlock, I'm going to mix some metaphors, but unlock a logjam.
Yeah. The government is talking about 50% affordable housing in certain instances, which must have a significant impact on land value.
Yeah. I mean, it's talking about it in relation to greenbelt releases, not as a general rule, although affordable housing requirements obviously do increase. And it's a great thing. It's a great thing to make more houses available for those that need the support. But yes, it doesn't help land value. And of course, there's no point having a policy of 50% affordable housing if there's no housing association that's going to take them on.
I think it is important to note as well that housing associations nationally are becoming very active in acquiring market-led schemes, not just Section 106 units, but actually acquiring the whole of a development site, building some market sale units and delivering perhaps additional Section 106 units by way of additionality and converting those market units to affordable units. And they seem to be very active at the moment, but obviously curbed by potential funding and rounds of funding to support their requirements.
Yeah, I mean, it leads us nicely into looking at sort of some of the new government housing policies. So green belt and grey belt initiatives. I mean, the government has made a lot of noises about starting to build in areas that we haven't been too successful in building in to date. What's your understanding of the grey belt situation?
I think the government policy is all around increasing housing numbers. And in order to do that, what the strategy is that local planning authorities are going to be under more of a compulsion to deliver these new higher targets, with penalties introduced if they don't. And there's been a reinstatement of the 5-year housing land supply, which was put to one side in 2023, even where there's a recent local plan that does identify land for development. But it is important to note that grey belt releases are only really justifiable where the local planning authority isn't able to deliver the numbers that it's got to do, and it's got to look somewhere else for land.
What is the definition of grey belt then?
So I suppose no one really knows, do they?
Well, the
What's our best guess?
the draft NPPF attempts to define grey belts in that it's land in the green belt comprising previously developed land and any other parcels and or areas of green belt that make a limited contribution to the 5 green belt purposes.
I mean, I've read many bodies, such as the RICS, for example, they're concerned it just won't work as currently drafted. I read somewhere the other day, the House Builders Federation, they said that land not strongly performing against any greenbelt purpose is a high bar to set. And similarly, others will probably worry that it's just ineffective because greenbelt plays a more than limited role in protecting the countryside from encroachment. That's essentially what it does. I'd say that clearer definitions are needed to avoid endless appeals.
And just going back to the new methodology of assessing housing needs across the UK, under the current methodology, local authorities are required to provide 305,000 homes, and the new methodology will require local authorities nationally to provide north of 370,000 homes per annum.
So I think it's important to say that the consultation on the NPPF isn't just about greenbelt and housing numbers. They're the things that steal the headlines, but there are some other important issues that affect the land market, one of which is more of a focus on affordable housing for rent, as opposed to low-cost ownership, and the introduction of a requirement that 50% of all houses allocated or approved in the green belt should be affordable. Luckily, that is subject to viability because the delivery of a significant greenbelt site comes with an enormous amount of cost, and it may just not be viable to deliver 50% affordable housing. And so with increased sustainability requirements, which we'll talk about, with a need to provide more affordable housing, something's got to give in the overall equation, and that tends to be land value. And as a result of that, they've introduced a consultation proposals for a change in approach as to how you assess viability. And that's important for us because a lot of our work is viability assessment related. So they're going to change the definition, which changes the influence. They're going to say now that a landowner is due existing use value plus a reasonable and proportionate premium, which is a very different emphasis on what it used to be, which was a minimum return at which it is considered a reasonable landowner would be willing to sell their land. It's going to be fascinating as to see how that plays out, but inevitably, I think the inference is greenbelt land releases will come with a lower benchmark land value, as it is referred to in viability circles, which generally means that the landowner will need to be accepting less in terms of net land value. Viability is all around an assessment of whether a scheme can provide policy compliant requirements, particularly in terms of affordable housing, but also in terms of contributions towards education or allotments or open space, where that isn't covered by community infrastructure levy. So it is all based upon setting a benchmark land value, which is generally at the moment considered to be existing use value plus a premium, and that premium plus the EUV needs to be enough to persuade a landowner to deliver their land. And that's where the change is coming. There's usually a lot of argument over what EUV plus a premium is in terms of quantum, but it informs benchmark land value. And it is that benchmark that you then test against the value of the scheme for which planning permission is being granted. And if the scheme is worth more than the benchmark land value, then it's viable. And if it's worth less, then it's unviable. and you generally play around with affordable housing levels or contribution levels until the two meet.
Okay, thanks, Guy. So let's dive into biodiversity net gain, which is something that some of our listeners won't necessarily understand what it is. So, Will, can you dive in and give us a brief explanation of what it is?
Of course, James. So essentially, all new developments further to the regulations being adopted needs to provide at least 10% improvement in biodiversity of the site, preferably on site, but alternatively off site, or through the purchase of BNG credits. So essentially, a site, let's say it's greenfield parcel of land, it's assessed with a baseline assessment, and the subsequent, let's say, assume it's a residential development takes place. The site after the development therefore needs to provide a 10% improvement on the initial baseline assessment. So depending on the nature of the site, if it's a small brownfield site in a town or city, it might be more difficult to provide that enhancement.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting for the listener at this point is that we have got a team within BK that specialises in BNG solutions, and so if anyone's got any queries or a problem, then certainly give them a ring.
Good point. Well made, Guy. Just circling back, excusing my ignorance, but nitrate and water neutrality, what does that entail?
Essentially, nutrient neutrality is another similar policy that effectively requires a developer to ensure that the runoff from a development site isn't detrimental to wildlife. EU directive, habitat regulations, which is affecting both existing planning consents and future planning consents. I think there's 27 catchment areas across the UK and 62 local planning authorities affected.
Right.
And it's estimated that it could be restricting development of tens of thousands of homes per year, because essentially, if there is a catchment area with a restriction, development can't take place until mitigation measures for nutrient neutrality, phosphate, nitrate runoff from a development site is dealt with and mitigated.
I mean, a point that is also being mentioned in sustainability by the government is obviously the energy infrastructure gaps, which we know from our utility infrastructure team within the business. There are some critical areas where not just electricity, but there's issues around water supply. So if we look at Cambridgeshire's expansion in the east of England, major issues around electricity. We're doing major work for UKPN to enhance the provision of electricity into the city. Anglian Water doing major water retention schemes to increase the volume of water to facilitate development. So it's a very, again, fragmented picture probably across the UK in terms of utility and infrastructure supplies, which again is going to impact where you build houses, I would suspect. It's multifaceted and multi-layered.
Yeah, I think it's more when you're going to build houses than where, but there are some horror stories out there about schemes unable to be delivered because it's going to take years for a grid upgrade. And so, that's extremely frustrating for developers and landowners, in particular. But it's getting worse because of the general need to move away from gas boilers, as I mentioned earlier on, and EV charging points.
And the government have legislated and tried to regulate and have introduced changes in building regulations over recent years to improve the energy efficiency of newly constructed dwellings. But in doing so, those newly constructed dwellings are utilising more, as Harry's referenced, ground source air source heat pumps, draw on electricity on the grid, requirement for electric vehicle charging points, and the increasing numbers of electrical vehicles, and therefore increased draw on the electric grid. So whilst a lot of these new homes will be very energy efficient, more energy efficient, they'll still have a greater requirement on electricity as opposed to gas boilers.
We've got the budget looming around the corner, which probably means that the most topical subject for us today is to talk about some of the rumours as opposed to the confirmed aspects to the budget around taxation and potential impact on economic uncertainty. However, one thing that we do know is that the government's confirmed that capital gains tax is likely to be reviewed. That rising uncertainty around potential increases in capital gains tax, that's going to have a big impact on landowners.
Absolutely, James. We're seeing a lot of landowners take stock of their net positions at the moment. So potentially selling their site now for a lesser sum at the current CGT rate versus selling it at a later date, perhaps for a higher figure, but with a higher CGT rate. So they are taking stock of that. I think we've seen a flurry of activity at the moment with many landowners trying to sell their assets prior to the autumn budget towards the end of the year. I think there's been a lot of press devoted to the worst case scenarios on CGT at 45%. So a massive concern for landowners, and it's causing, I suppose, a flurry and frenzy of activity in the market at the moment.
And I think there's two elements to that. Landowners that are already party to an option or promotion agreement might not be able to change their tax position once a site gains consent and subsequently sells or is acquired by a developer. But those landowners that do have strategic land that might have opportunities going forwards, it's a question for them now as to their willingness to enter into an agreement or to sell their land going forwards.
Just on that subject as well, the tax freezer clauses in promotion option agreements may well be invoked if that tax burden becomes too high, say 50 to 60%. I know a lot of my tax freezer clauses acting for landowners are included to protect their interests in that regard. So they may well be invoked if that tax burden becomes too high.
I think it's a real balance of landowners needing to sell versus wanting to sell, and will it limit activity in wider markets of brownfield land sales or commercial buildings which might have scope for conversion to residential accommodation? It is really whether a seller has to sell or wants to sell, and whether they'll accept those higher CGT rates.
Yeah, and if we're talking about housing delivery and the government's push to deliver ambitious housing targets, if the tax burden's too high, and if landowners don't have to sell, as you say, many will just take stock of the situation currently and assess if the position changes later on. And this will slow down delivery from the grassroots, housing delivery from the grassroots.
Yeah, I think they'll tend to look at the cumulative emerging positions that they've got. Likely more affordable housing, likely higher costs of delivery through BNG and nutrient neutrality, likely higher costs of meeting building regulation improvements. So all of that means lower land values, and then add a burden of, let's say, 45%. I hope it isn't as high as that, but let's say it is. A landowner is always very good at comparing what their mate got last year with what someone's going to tell them they're going to get this year. And I think if people don't have to sell, as you're saying, Will, people will take stock, will sit back and think, maybe I'll just wait for times to change.
It sounds like the dangers of unintended consequences, doesn't it? Because if you stand back from the overall discussion around the whole budget, Rachel Reeves has said it's all about growth. Well, there's quite a few things potentially in there that are going to inhibit growth within the economy, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of incentivization in there. And like you say, if people are not compelled to transact, then they won't. And also, presumably people are going to take longer to take new tax advice, which then draws out and potentially renegotiate. So again, you can just imagine it starts to slow down a process that was, going at a certain speed. But once the tax changes come in, there's been various numbers up to 45%, but I think the reality is it's going up. So there's no doubt about it. Everybody's standing by their beds. But it does seem to be that there is a cause and effect to these things. People don't just take them in their stride. People have to reevaluate and readjust, whether at a personal level or a company level.
We don't know the impact as well on the private rental sector. An increasing proportion of houses nationally are entering by way of PRS schemes and private landlords. A number of new housing estates, housing delivery is provided by way of rentals. So we don't know how it's going to impact those landlords and the incentives for them to keep stock entering the market.
Yeah, because the market acts in a very simple way, doesn't it? Where people can, make a margin, they'll interact with the margin. Where that is eroded to a point where they won't necessarily do that. So I think your point earlier about whether people are compelled or not will be an interesting one. Time will tell, but I think we'll probably find out quite quickly post-budget on a number of key issues, I think, in terms of what the market sentiment is. But I think from what you're saying generally is that it's going to impact and it's going to require landowners to have another look at the deal they've probably got on the table and take tax advice. So,
Absolutely.
So quite a lot to think about there in terms of taxation and CGT. Lots of issues around the budget that's going to impact land and property. So tune into the Landmark podcast that's coming out on the 31st, where we're going to be discussing and reviewing everything that's in the budget. Why do house builders and developers want to do what they do in certain parts of the country but not in others? Because I think you'd look at the UK and if you stood back and looked, you think, well, there's an awful lot of land in the north of England. Why does everybody want to be in the south, southeast, and southwest? And what are the raw drivers that's impacting that market decision-making process that doesn't align with what government has been trying to do for a very long time, which is, the new word is levelling up, isn't it? In terms of let's have levelling up where the north looks like the south. Well, you can only do that if government's going to interfere significantly with funding and policy changes, because in truth, the dynamics around the UK is that, London is a massive pull in terms of lots and lots of things. And there's key parts of the south and southeast, southwest where people want to live and work. But can we just sort of broaden that out so people can understand, what are the drivers around the decision-making process about location?
I think for a developer, it's all around risk, isn't it? You're far more likely to sell a house in a hotspot, and it doesn't need to be just in the south because there are hotspots all over the place. But it's around risk and their perception and their experience of being able to sell a house within a reasonable time frame to give them a return on their capital. And at a profit. With the increase in house prices that the northern regions have seen, that's going to make those areas a lot more attractive from a developer's perspective. And with the significant increases in housing need calculations that are coming through, you'd have expected people to start focusing on that area perhaps more than they have. But that rather belittles the fact that there are lots of developers up there doing everything that they can do to deliver houses in the right areas. But there are parts of the southeast that people would rather come second on a list, but they still build there because generally speaking, it's going to meet the demand, and it has to meet demand. There's, I suppose, one of the issues around increasing housing numbers significantly is, well, what's that going to do to land values? And are there really that many extra purchasers out there? Because if you release a lot of land, I'm not silly enough to think this is going to happen overnight, but if you release a lot of land into a particular market, then land values are likely to tumble. House prices are likely to tumble because there's more competition,
which would solve the government's issue.
Yeah, probably.
Job done.
We've just come up with the government policy there, Guy. No, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of it points to infrastructure as well, because certain parts of the country have got much better infrastructure.
Desirability.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, which is at many levels for families. There are key decisions around schooling, education, ease of access to work, leisure opportunities. So there's a whole raft of things which I'm not always sure people understand around. The decision-making process for house builders. It is about risk, isn't it? But it's also about making sure that they get the right product in the right place. So lots of different designs, types, styles of houses. Your demographics and your sociographics, you need to be providing something that's fit for purpose, which I think by and large house builders are really good at doing. They do the research, they know what they're doing, they take their time. which I think is some of the fear that people have, perhaps, is that if it's a more blanket approach to things, then mistakes will be made. But at least with the slow plan-led approach, there's lots of time to make the right decision. So, but I think from what you guys are saying, nothing's particularly going to be speeded up significantly in the short term anyway.
And with the MPPF consultation that's now ended, I think government have announced they've had over 10,000 consultee responses. To consider all those responses, feedback back through into an updated NPPF, perhaps a further round of consultation, and then the requirement to make it law, go through legislation. It's not going to be a quick process.
No, but I think we touched upon it earlier in terms of the nuts and bolts practical elements of the market. Even if it was easier and quicker to get a planning consent in place, have we got the infrastructure and the workforce to deliver an extra 100,000 units a year? Given that even on an anecdotal basis, it's quite difficult from a tradesman's perspective to get a whole raft of things done at the moment in the UK. And I think one of the things that national house builders have been very good at is still keeping the sausage machine going, where some of the smaller builders, certainly in my part in the East Midlands, have really, really struggled with certain trades to keep a project on time and on budget, because it's a flow of tradespeople coming into a scheme. There's an art to getting it right, isn't there?
And they've been exposed to high finance rates as well.
It's all supply and demand, because a developers, even if they secure numerous planning consents to increase their potential supply, they're likely only going to build in line with market absorption and to the requirement of supporting their end sales revenues, and such that they don't have built stock sat there unsold without a purchaser.
Yeah,
so it's also incentivizing a buyer to acquire those units.
So it's just circling back to planning then. So we identified that there's a significant shortage, so as the government, of planning people and planning teams in local authorities. So why doesn't the government outsource it? Put it into the hands of private consultancies, speed up the process, put some KPIs in place, rather than trying to do the long stop, which is let's get kids into university, let's teach them to become planning officers, let's get them into local authorities, which with the best will in the world is a 3 to 5 year scenario.
We've started to see that in some LPAs, so they have started to introduce that, but it's just not enough at the moment.
No, because it's that throughput. I mean, there's volume in the system, isn't it? How do you get throughput? How do you process things? And it's, even if it was a short-term exercise, to put it out into the realms of the private sector, just to get some of those applications through and out the other side, it could be money well spent in terms of the add value to the public purse.
And of course, planning fees recently increased on applications as well, and how that's going to transpire through to a more efficient application process or not. Similarly, 300 new officers throughout the UK, how they're going to be identified and employed.
It's inspectors also at appeal stage that I think will be a backlog. So they'll be in short supply as well. That needs to be considered also, because that's just another layer of the conveyor belt, isn't it?
Yeah, when you put stress on a system, you find very quickly where the weaknesses are, don't you? And I think the point is, if we're saying some of these initiatives that governments are going to introduce help to alleviate and to push things through, but is it going to push it through to the next stage where it then bottlenecks because there isn't enough to deal with the inspectors for appeals, etc. So it doesn't feel terribly top to bottom. I think it probably feels like they're looking at 2 or 3 of the key and obvious areas. But as you guys have been alluding to, it's a very long process that involves lots and lots of stages.
Recent announcements as well, with a number of local authorities in financial difficulties, selling off parcels of land, trying to raise capital and resource, just highlights the cost implications with a number of local authorities.
Yeah, but you'd have a hope that increase in planning fees would resolve that to a degree. That must be there to fund additional resource.
I think if you put a taxation on developers, or just tell the developers if they want development to come forward, they need to pay an additional tax, whereby there is additional support for local planning authority. So effectively, they're paying for that resource. I don't think developers would be adverse to that because they're just seeing that delivery come through a lot quicker. Those applications heard a lot quicker. There's a tax associated with supplying more planning officers at LPA level, then that may speed up the supply chain.
I suppose really the key thing for landowners is to take good professional advice. It clearly is a very complex landscape out there. The journey from a greenfield piece of land all the way through to a consent for the development of housing is something that we're extremely well equipped to deal with, but it's a long process and it's a very complex one.
I think the ability to draw on internal expertise and a variety of skill sets, whether it's BNG, battery, solar, viability, valuation, is really important. And we've got those services and skills in-house such that we're not necessarily needing to go to third parties for advice.
Yeah, and I think in terms of positioning, we've got really strong reputations in our existing centres, with the prospect of more land coming through. That means, there are more opportunities for our existing clients and new clients that we can really focus upon there. But I think, there's the opportunity of moving into areas that we haven't been so strong in before, where there is a real increase in unit numbers. That will mean landowners will need advice, strong, independent and focused advice in order to bring their bits of land forward in the most appropriate way. So, I can foresee a situation where we do start to move into new geographic locations, offering the same skills that we currently do to our clients in the Southwest, Southeast and the Midlands.
We're very proactive in early identification of opportunities, whether it's potential areas of greenbelt release or areas of our clients' land that was previously less favourable, that in light of the new NPPF changes may become more favourable, and taking that forward with either a developer promoter on board or our in-house planning resource to submit representations and to try and take that land further.
So we've covered a lot of ground there. In conclusion, the market seems to be stable with a relatively good outlook for the future. More development land coming through the development pipeline is to be welcomed. LPAs need more resources. It's not a criticism, it's just a fact. Exciting times ahead in terms of planning and housing policy terms, and we're looking forward to following the NPPF consultation. Budget might have an impact on land availability, particularly when looked at in a cumulative way. I think we're all standing by our beds in respect of that one. And we'd be glad to hear from any listeners who want to reach out for more information on the topics we have covered. And of course, if you need any planning and development advice, we're very well placed to offer strategic advice on all aspects of the development process. So please get in touch. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to Landmark on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We'll be back soon with more experts and insights on the ever-changing world of property and development. Until then, I'm James Bailey, and this is Landmark, your guide to unlocking the potential of property. Take care and see you next time.